Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Feldenkrais Summit. Move better, feel better. I'm Lavinia Plonka, and I'm very happy to be working with this theme about physical challenges. And today I'm going to be talking with Dwight Pargee, who I actually have known for a really long time, and we're colleagues, and I really appreciate Dwight's unique way of expressing the work, especially when he teaches in large groups, which is where I've experienced him. Dwight is a combination of an athlete as well as a free spirit. He's a martial
Mhm.
artist. I know that he loves to fish and go out into the woods, but he also has degrees in exercise physiology, body mechanics. I'm sure it was supposed to be biomechanics and other degrees. He's an assistant trainer, and he has his practice in Bend, Oregon, where he has worked with thousands of people, working from recovery of severe injuries to high performance athletes. And so it's kind of interesting. Today, we're going to be interviewing Dwight about his own personal challenges coming from his life as an athlete to some severe injuries that he had to recover from. I believe that the name of Dwight's talk is something like learning to walk again and again and again. So, Dwight, welcome. It's really good to see you.
Yeah, thanks. Good to be here. And the move better, feel better has been my mantra for the last 2 years since I got sick and lost my ability to walk. Actually, so I'm slowly on the recovery path. And this is going to be interesting for me because I really haven't had a chance to really talk about my process, publicly. So yeah.
Well, the first question that comes up for me, oh, I'm sorry, were you going to say something?
No. Yeah.
Okay. The first question that comes up for me is, as you were speaking, was this definition of health that Moshe Feldenkrais spoke about a lot, the ability or how quickly we can recover from shock. And you were just describing a journey that took a couple of years. So maybe you can talk a little bit about, well, how it all began and then what was the process?
Yeah, about almost 2 years. It'll be 2 years in April. I was teaching in a Feldenkrais training program, and I got really sick. It was basically some type of viral pneumonia, like a walking pneumonia, bronchitis type of thing. And in the middle of the night, I lost function of my legs. I literally had to crawl to the bathroom in the middle of the night, and knew something was severely wrong. I had lost sensation from the waist down, didn't know what was going on, and was able to get to a hospital pretty quickly. And they kept me in there for a week just testing because they had to rule about 18 different things out, including things like brain tumors, spine tumors, meningitis, multiple sclerosis, all these things that could possibly thing they didn't really know. And then it finally came down. I got a pretty definite diagnosis of, it was called transverse myelitis. So basically what happened was the virus infection in my lungs somehow created an autoimmune response in my spine, and my spine swelled, and then it took out, it damaged the upper motor neuron axon. So I ended up with a spinal lesion, about the size of a pinhead, way up at C71 area, but it took out, kind of the whole below my navel was just numb in a way.
It's so amazing and humbling to think that something the size of a pinhead could do that to our nervous system, and we start to see just how intricately designed we are. And by the way, those of you who are new to some of the terminology that we're using, C7 is your seventh cervical vertebra, T1 is the top of the thorax, so it's the area right really at the bottom of your neck. So
Yeah.
basically from the neck down, you were compromised, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
So then what happened, as they say in storytelling?
Yeah. my neurologist who actually made, I mean, there was some infighting on the actual diagnosis. It took a while for them to come up with what was actually going on. And then by that time, all my symptoms from being sick was gone, except I was just left. Basically, the virus came, did its damage, and left. So I didn't have any reoccurring, symptoms, except that I didn't have function. I was actually on a walker for about 3 months. I couldn't work. I could barely sit because the nature of the injury took out what we call our righting reflexes. So righting reflexes in the spine is like if you ever play with your cat and toss your cat up in the air or drop your
Oh
cat,
yeah, I do that
right?
all the time.
Cat acrobatics, right? And so they have a way. We're mammals, so we all have a way of creating this uprightness, right? It's a reflexive action. Well, this injury took that out, and so I was having to use a lot of other muscles to stabilize. And my process was Feldenkrais. It was, I mean, I had my wonderful wife Maru bring me my Feldenkrais mat in the hospital. I was there for a couple of weeks getting treatment. They were trying to get the swelling down on the spine to make sure to limit any damage. And I was doing multiple lessons a day. And there's this idea in our work that we call we move in accordance, or we act in accordance with our self-image. So when I lay down, and there's a whole series of lessons that I had known before, and it's called these 5 lines or primary image lessons, where you visualize these just basic. It's almost like a stick figure representation of our internal relationships. And that was like gone, or like half of it was gone. It was like I couldn't even visualize. I didn't have the sensory feedback to visualize that.
So could you, I know I'm interrupting you, but
Yeah, no,
you just brought up to me one of the major ways that we begin to understand our perceived self-image. And even though we're sitting, I wonder if you could at least take us through an image of those 5 cardinal lines, just so that the people who are watching could get a sense of what you were trying to do.
Yeah.
Is that possible? Just
Absolutely.
2 minutes?
Absolutely. And the reason this is so important, because this internal image is really, I like to call it like our internal GPS system. It's what our brain uses, how to control our movement, our motor control. And so if that's not clear, nothing's going to be clear. Nothing's going to work. So in my sense, my thinking was I need to reconnect that somehow first. And so, yeah, if you just sit and you can feel your support from your sit bones, and the cardinal middle
Eyes open,
line.
eyes closed. How do you think it's best?
It's generally better. Your feeling sense, your kinesthetic sense, will be greatly increased if you close your eyes, right? So we reduce visual input.
I'm going to be your guinea pig.
And sit and just feel the support coming from your sit bones. And then the middle line, or the central line, goes from your tailbone, from your coccyx, right up through the top of your head. And when you visualize this line, you don't have to know anatomy, right? So you don't have to relate it to your bones or your tissues or muscles or fascia or anything. It's just really a length, like you stretched an imaginary thread or a string from your tailbone to the top of your head. And if you can locate that inside of you. Sometimes when people do this, there's like their line is hovering outside of them somewhere in the air. But if you can, and that it'll come, right? So you feel that, and then right at the base of your neck, that kind of first thoracic vertebrae is kind of like a bump or a hump. That you can imagine another line, like shooting a thread or a string from that point through your right shoulder, down your right arm, your forearm, your wrist, to your right index finger. So then you have 2 lines, right? You have the long line going upwards, and the directions are kind of important too. Just imagine kind of the line being stretched upwards, and then the line outwards from the base of the neck to the right, and then do another one from that same point at the base of the neck through the shoulder of the left shoulder, down the left arm, to the left forearm, the left wrist, to the left index finger.
So it doesn't matter whether, there's a part of me that wants to kind of go out like the Da Vinci Man in
Yeah.
order to
Well, so
feel that line.
when I
But
think,
so I don't
is,
have to, I can
yeah,
just kind of draw the line down.
sure. Yeah, because that's what you're doing up in gravity. So it's much easier also if people, when you first start to do this, is to lie down and you actually make the Da Vinci Man kind of with the arms out and the legs out, because it's much easier to feel that out of gravity. So just sitting here, your postural muscles are engaged, your balance system's engaged. So it is a little bit more difficult, but you have a long experience, you can do it. But if it's difficult for people to feel this, lie down. It's always easier to visualize lying down and to
Now,
really the sensory connection.
I don't know about you, but I know a lot of times people will say to me when they first done this exercise that, like, as they were envisioning it, suddenly the line disappeared or the line got all mushy or the line
Yeah.
grayed out. And I wonder if you had any experience like that while you were trying to bring yourself into your self-image. And what are our resources in a moment like that?
Yeah. Well, yeah. So let me. We'll go on with it. We'll complete the image, and I'll talk to you about my
Oh,
experience
okay.
later
Sorry.
on.
I
Yeah.
forgot about my
So
legs.
so we're only three. We're only 3/5 of the way there. Okay. So again, feel that area now down where your tailbone is, and then you can even use your fingers since you're sitting here. You can bring your fingers into like your groin area to feel where your pubic bone is, and then somewhere in the middle you can run another line through the right hip joint, through the right knee, down to the right heel. Again, if you're lying on the ground, then you have a long leg. Here we have the leg bent, and so the lines will bend. And then another similar one from the left, through the left hip joint, all the way through the left knee, down to the left heel. And then in my experience, these two lines were, they kind of like, if you ever watched, before we had cable TV, remember sometimes the TV went out and it flickered or it got fuzzy on the channel. That's what my experience was. It was like kind of there, kind of not. I kind of knew, I was guessing almost internally of where that was. There was not a clear. It was strange. It was strange. It would flicker in, flicker out, disappear. And for sure, like the more I fatigued, because I was doing so much work just to sit up, just to move around on a walker, it was a high fatigue factor. So then the lines kind of dimmed, right? And so it became like a daily practice, and there's a whole set. There's maybe up to like 21 of these lessons that are related that help, or in Feldenkrais movement lessons or awareness to movement lessons, we're using these micro movements to fill in the gaps, right? To fill in the spaces neurologically in a way. So that's where I started, with a really big gap between my own intention to be able to move and then the action I was actually able to produce, right? So that's along the axons of the nerves. That's the messaging, and that messaging was cuckoo. it was all mucked up, and so I started with that, and I did a lot of work with that to kind of create a better template for myself in a way.
So I'm sure that during this process, there was also an emotional component. I mean, we speak in our work about that there's always thinking, feeling, sensing, and movement. And, I know of you as like a very optimistic, positive thinking kind of person. And then here you find yourself in this situation. Um, did you have to struggle with any sort of emotional situations? And if so, was Feldenkrais a resource for you, or did you have to go to something else?
Yeah, I've been asked that a few times, and yeah, I mean, there's a huge amount of fear of when you don't even know what's going on. The outlook, the neurologist, I mean, she's great. I have a great team that I work with, and she said, most likely you're going to recover your function. I can't tell you how much. I can't tell you how long, and that's what it is. And she goes, there's a few things that we can do to help the process along. There's a few things you can do to get in the way of the process for sure. And then it's kind of like, well, let's wait and see. And that was like terrifying for me. And I had this wonderful, wonderful history of working with Feldenkrais method. So I was, I say, right in the hospital, even before I knew what was going on, I could tell, something was not connected in me. So I started working with myself, and I just said, I need to really trust this method and see what it can really do. Because otherwise I would have been down the rabbit hole for sure. But I think that's why I chose that quote that we're gonna talk about, because it was definitely a moment of choice of like, I can freak out, or I can try to do what I can do and have I call it like biological optimism.
Oh, that's a
And
perfect term,
right,
actually.
and it is, and I think in my experience of working with my clients, especially people who have had stroke and brain injuries and severe accidents, there's something in us that it can be, I think we can evoke that in our work. I think we can evoke that. And I needed to do that with myself again. This isn't the first injury I've had. I've had a long history of working with myself, but this is for sure the one that took me out in a way that I really challenged me, and it continues to challenge
So you said a couple of things that I would like to go back to so that we can kind of unpack them a little bit.
me.
And one of them, you used the word fear, and then a little bit later you talked about the unknown. And I think that sometimes with awareness through movement lessons, even those of us who have gone over a lesson over and over and over again, and so we know the sequence, in order to really be able to learn, we need to be able to face that unknown, because if it's known, then there's nothing to learn, right?
Yeah.
So this question of how can this process, and use the word trust also, of trusting that the unknown can help with fear, because I think that a lot of people, whenever they've had some kind of a traumatic illness or an injury, are dealing with not just fear that they won't recover, but fear of the pain, fear of something happening again. And how, to me, how can I look at an awareness through movement or a functional integration session as a way that I could begin to trust this unknown? Can you say something to that?
Yeah, it might seem strange, but it actually might make sense to you. On the flip side, the paradox of the fear and the unknown is creativity. And and I've learned that before, and I don't think I really knew it at this depth, at the cellular level. But here I am. This is a constraint, and they said, "Well, this is what you got." And so I was like, "Okay, what can I work? How can I create?" And that's this idea of autopoiesis, this idea of like self-organization or self-creation in a way, and work with myself to create something new. And so I turned. I think it was a very conscious choice to turn my fear into action in a very methodical way, and still not quite knowing the outcome. But I knew for sure if I didn't try something, it wasn't going to be helpful. So, and it builds, right? You get small success. You see progress over time, and so then that builds. It builds that confidence, and it builds your trust. It trust in yourself. It trust in your own system that healing can happen if you take care of yourself.
Can you, I'm going to hold my other question from before,
Yeah,
because you brought up the word constraint. And that's something that we actually use intentionally in our lessons sometimes in order to find new pathways or new possibilities.
sure.
And here you were given a constraint, or I don't know if you were given, you had a constraint dumped on you, but
Yeah.
um, were you able, can you speak about how your understanding of constraints from the Feldenkrais perspective might have helped you as you dealt with this constraint?
Yeah. So, a simple example for people who don't know is often in awareness through movement lessons, the design of the lesson will add a constraint to limit movement in one area, to amplify or exaggerate or bring awareness to another area. So if you lie on your back with your legs bent and just tilting your legs left and right, you get certain relative movement in the hip joints, in the pelvis, through the spine, maybe for some people up even in the rib cage. But if you cross one leg on top of each other, so you basically constrain the hips from moving, then the relative movement has to happen farther up the spine into the ribs, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you can actually learn something new. A constraint in that way provides an opportunity to learn something new. And I knew that. I knew that from my teaching. And so I was able to adopt that as a philosophy. I'm like, well, here's my constraint. How can I take this as an opportunity to create some new patterns or relearn. I'm learning to walk again, but I'm sure my walk is going to, it's not just by trying to go back to what I was. It's just going to be, I'm just going to be new again, once again.
Right. So in the newness, maybe you're discovering other things that can help find the new Dwight in a way, right?
Yeah, for
Um,
sure.
so when you were kind of moving from semi-paralysis to coming to vertical, what was that like? I mean, did they force you to hop on the walker, or what was your process?
At the beginning, I was trying everything to see kind of what stuck and what was helpful. So for sure, I did the usual physical therapy, rehabilitative stuff, which is a lot of repetition, not a whole lot of variation. And there's a couple cool things I did, like with assisted walking on a treadmill. They had my physical therapist, who also happens to be a Feldenkrais practitioner, so it's a nice combination. But he put me on an air support treadmill that was able to you wear a big bag around the lower part of your body, and it fills up with air, so you can change your body weight. Basically, it's like almost like a flotation, like walking in water, which allowed my legs to move. And some of that was helpful in the repatterning. I felt that if I did too much of that, it actually was detrimental. I basically just kind of get this thing called extensor tonuses, and my whole spine would just then kind of go into spasm. And so little bits of that was relatively effective, but I got so much more bang for my buck from getting hands-on Feldenkrais, the functional integration lesson. And I was literally I do spend off 2 to 3 hours a day doing awareness through movement. It feels so much better. I get much better relief, and I think it's more integrative, right? Which is what I need. I'm all about the integration.
Right. So it's interesting. You use the word repatterning, and every once in a while, well, not every once in a while, a lot of times people come to Feldenkrais because we talk about reorganizing our nervous system, reorganizing our function, and people don't understand that, and they ask, how long is it going to take for you to repattern my habits? I know you've had the same experience, which is why I'm bringing it up. And I'm just wondering how you would, for our audience, help differentiate repatterning in the traditional medical model versus reorganization from the Feldenkrais perspective.
Yeah, good question. Well, I think, just from what I know of current brain science and this idea of neuroplasticity. So neuroplasticity happens, right? It's always happening. It's you can think of it as a learning model. We're always in relation with our environment, in relation with ourselves in the environment. And in Feldenkrais, we use that ability for our nervous systems to learn by doing these kind of like micro movements, micro stimulations, which in a way can create these new nervous pathways. Repatterning for me is, even though maybe I use the term with myself, when somebody else is trying to do that to you, it seems like something from the outside being forced on you. So I don't see it as more of as a as an organic process, as opposed to like the self-organization aspect. Even when I'm working with my clients hands-on, even though I'm touching and supporting and feeling somebody, they're doing the integration, right? It's their nervous system and brain that integrates the touch, the pressure, the movement sensations. It's not something I'm saying, do it like this. It's not a rule-based pattern, right?
So, but we do a lot of repetition, right?
Uh-huh.
I remember when I first encountered the Feldenkrais method was in one of Moshe's books where he had the lessons written out and he would say, and now lift your head 25 times. And I would be like, bang, 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 bang. And I felt better, but, but I think that again, we have to look at, well, what happens when we use repetition versus the way you just spoke about it, which it doesn't have that awareness component in it. At least that's my
Yeah,
impression, right?
I just think repetition without awareness is useless. It's just training monkeys or something. But what we can say in Feldenkrais, I would say it's repetition with variation, and the variation is really important so that we kind of expand our whatever our latent potential is there. The variation will bring out these even on a micro level, lifting your head. Every time you lift your head, you can subtly change the trajectory, right, a little bit. So that little micro variation creates more variability in your system. And then for me, when you lose all that variability, you're just locked and you are walking, or not even walking, but moving like a block, and that those little variations are so important to be able to have that sensory motor connection.
I just thought of this, and it's so I don't know where I'm going to go with it, but it occurred to me that if the bottom of you was unable to move, you know how Moshe sometimes would talk about how you do one thing is how you do everything, and he would have people say lift a finger and go, great, you see how light your finger is? Now why can't you lift your leg like that? Did you ever play with those kind of ideas of like, well, geez, my arm can move, so can I have the same thing for my leg? Or
Yeah, fascinating. I mean, it's fascinating to ask that. When I think it was something that was revealed. We all have our own tendencies of how we relate to ourselves and work with ourselves. And so, my initial thing was like, I got to get my legs to move. I got to get my legs to move. And it's real frustrating because you just end up coming against this wall, bouncing against the wall. And even psychologically, emotionally, it's like my legs aren't moving. I'm trying to move my legs aren't moving. It's like can be a negative feedback loop. And I got a series of lessons with a trainer, of a Feldenkrais trainer, about a year after this all happened, and he worked kind of more generally with me. He worked a lot with my head and my neck and my arms. He worked a lot with rhythm and vibration through me. And it was fascinating to see how quickly I improved, how this primary image that we were talking about before, how clear it got, and it totally wiped me out. I mean, I almost couldn't walk when I got off the table because it was such a massive reorganization. But yet, over the days and the weeks following, I could say, oh, this really stimulated something, it woke something up. So now I come at it from many more dimensions, and I'm able to too. I'm able to do more of a variety of things.
Yeah, that reminds me of the classic stories we have where people come to see us and because they have a bad back, and we start working with their left big toe, and they're like, what are you doing? I have back pain. So it's almost the same thing that happened for you, and yet it brought different aspects of organization. So
Yeah.
I'm going to go all the way back now
Uh-huh.
because I still have been holding this other thought, and that has to do with the word choice. You talked about choice. I don't know if you remember. It was a few minutes
Yeah.
ago.
Yeah. No, yeah.
but this idea of that when we have some kind of a debilitating illness or injury, how we feel that our choices are limited, and how do and well, speak about, if you could, about how the Feldenkrais method helps me kind of open up the possibilities of choice.
Yeah, a very wise teacher of mine who is no longer with us on the planet um, put it very simply. And what sometimes these simple things that go deep, it really stuck with me years ago. About at any given moment, upon awakening every day when you wake up, you can bring your awareness to yourself, and you can feel, you can sense, am I open to possibility? Am I open to the world? Am I closed down, or am I somewhat neutral? And at that point, it's a choice of how do I want to be.
Hmm.
If I do, if I'm, and there's reasons we contract, right? There, for fear, for pain, for sickness. It pulls us deep in ourselves. It pulls us into a ball, and we, in any moment, we have a choice to, like, okay, how can I move myself on this other spectrum? How can I create the openness, the lightness I want? I mean, even neutrality would be great when you're in a chronic flexed, contracted state.
Hmm.
But I think that's really important to realize that, in the worst of scenarios, it's amazing if we think about humans and what they endure in the world. But even in a lot of severe situations, we do have some type of choice, that we can do something to better ourselves, I think.
Hmm. And well, that kind of brings me back to the question of, um, how do we, like, if someone came to see you with the same problem that, God forbid, but with the same thing that had happened to you, how would you begin to work with that person?
Yeah, this has happened already. and
So,
and what
so do you think that,
and,
like, this was fate, and you had this thing
no,
happen to you so that now you could go out and help the world?
no, I don't think that way. But I thought and I continue to work. There are actually a couple, and you start to realize that we have these things that we call medical diagnosis, and puts us into a category. And even with somebody with a similar diagnosis or the same diagnosis, how they present, what they can do, what their experience is, where they are, psychologically, it's totally different. And so how I start working with somebody, I have to meet them where they are. I can surely call upon my own experience of what I know is effective. I can feel that, because I can feel in myself what needs to happen. I can feel with somebody else as I'm working with them. But it's really beginning to just connect with them where they're at in the beginning. And everyone's experience is different. And so I'm surely not an expert on spinal injury at this point. I have probably some useful things to offer people, but there you go. It's a work in progress. I'm
Mhm.
my own work in progress right now.
Did you, during this process of relearning and beginning again, this, I know you know this quote very well, this quote of realizing our avowed and our unavowed dreams. Did you feel that your personal dreams shifted in any way? Do you feel that uh, some things just went by the wayside that you would no longer be able to realize? Do you, how, I guess one could say, well, what is your relationship now to this idea of our avowed and unavowed dreams?
Yeah, and this happened right at a time in my life where I had a lot of big dreams. I had a lot going on, and it was really good. The future was bright, and I had all these possibilities, and it was going to be an exciting couple years. And this literally just, stopped me in my tracks, and
Huh.
and took me out in a way, and it challenged me in a way of how to live without having that. And it's a big challenge, and right now I'm not pushing it. I'm waiting to see what comes. I'm waiting to see what can emerge out of this, and it might be some of those same dreams. are going to be relative, and some of them I actually not so attached to. I had to give up in temporary, like, well, I just can't do that, and I had to turn. I was at that point. I was traveling all around North America. I have a whole group of NHL hockey players that were flying me to through Canada and through the East Coast to work with them during the season, and so it was really fun. It was something I've been working like my whole life towards, and I just had to say, like, I had to put myself on the disabled list and say, look, I just can't do this. I've learned to work remotely, like with this technology now with some people, and I'm able to travel now and able to, I'm actually able to hobble my little hobbit walk through airports and go on the road and teach a little bit more, but it's not so, I'm not so driven by it. It's like my whole focus is me getting better. And so I have to make sure I get good rest, good nutrition, time for my own work with myself. And I found a way that in an artistic way almost, it really helps me be more present with the people I'm with if I'm taking care of myself at that level.
So it sounds like two things happened, at least the way I hear it, is that your relationship to your dreams has changed, and maybe your attitude or your perspective on what dreams are really important changed. That's one thing, and you can just nod. but
Yeah. Yeah,
but
no,
then
right on. Yeah.
but then the other thing that I was thinking about was this, what you just described, of meeting people where they are. You could almost say, well, I've been there. I've not been exactly where you are, but this interruption of this trajectory in some way has changed the way you work. Would you say that's true?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I realize now even more the power of being present with that, with myself and another, and not having to know everything. I mean, surely I'm just kind of humbled by how much I don't know, and in the general world of how chaotic our lives really are in the world, and just being, well, okay with that, right? And not knowing always the next step. I've had to just be there, right? That's part of that learning through constraint. That's what definitely I've developed that more in my consciousness. It's something I think I always had at some point, but now it's something really in the foreground. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So if you were to, I don't want to put you on the spot or anything, but if you were to guide, like, let's just say that there's a bunch of people who are recovering from various limiting, constraining situations, whether they're mental or physical in their lives, and they're listening to us talking right now. I mean, you gave us the 5 cardinal lines, but is there some other somatic process that you could kind of suggest for us to begin to move away from this self-image of I can't or I'm unable to something else? Is that possible?
Yeah, I mean, I would suggest people. I mean, that's what we do. Get thee to a Feldenkrais practitioner. Because
Well,
that's our method in a way, is finding what you can do and then build on that. And I think that's, I was talking earlier about the series of lessons I had before, and it was just like, oh, that was clever. He worked with me in a way, in parts of me that were actually hadn't lost function, and use that to expand my function. And that's one of our options. We almost like get amnesia. When we get the sensory motor amnesia, when we have a lot of pain or a lot of difficulty or injury or sickness, we forget about those other parts of ourselves. And so, that's what I teach, and that's what you teach. We all teach that, so people can do lessons on their own. It's really helpful to work with somebody, um, and maybe initially just to put you on the right track.
so, well, you mentioned sensory motor amnesia. which I think is not just when a person has been injured. Uh, I I think that it's easy for anyone to just because they have a certain repertoire of movements or a certain series of habits or a certain way of doing things that there's sensory motor amnesia in terms of novelty or in terms of variation, in terms of how we use ourselves. So maybe for a moment, let's speak to how that impacts your regular person, if you can.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
Regular person. I can't believe I just said that.
yeah, regulars.
As opposed to the
I want to be a
irregular
regular
people.
guy again someday.
I've always thought of you as irregular, Dwight.
Thank
Anyway, it
you.
doesn't
Thank you.
matter.
That's a high compliment. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I'll take that. Yeah, I mean, uh, we are creatures of habit. We're mammals. Our mammalian nervous system, in a way, we have to create habits to survive, right? We just couldn't function in our lives. You couldn't sip your tea, check your phone, and walk up and down the stairs, which maybe is not a good idea. But we have the capacity to do that, and by doing that, it also creates these amnesia areas in ourselves where we're, the places where we don't pay attention to. And so, you know, that's why I think we say, like, Feldenkrais, we're good for humans and other mammals too. My dogs and cats and horses in the past have all love Feldenkrais work because it's integrated in that way. We're bringing those forgotten places into action, into that body schema, into that body image.
So would you say that this sensory motor amnesia, going back to this idea of repetition, is repetition without variation, and so then we lose the parts that haven't had another kind of experience? And maybe it kind of leads me to the question, and I'm sure you worked on this while you were recovering, is how to introduce novelty into your patterns.
Yeah, and for sure I do that myself because I know how to do that. One of my challenges is when I'm working with some of these professional athletes because they are so well strength trained, but in a way you can think of strength training as you're only strengthening what you know and the pattern, and often it's not so variable. So they know how to do something like maybe think about just a squat maneuver where you have a lot of weight, like 400 pounds on your bar, and you're squatting down and you're going up, and then that pattern gets ingrained and that gets strengthened in a way, but it limits this other sense of variability. The variability for an athlete, we want them to be able to move in any direction without hesitation, but they're actually detraining that ability just for the sake of strength in that one plane of action. So that's where the novelty of Feldenkrais lessons come in, is it adds this variability factor, this novelty factor, which our brains are evolved to love. I mean, our brains learn that way. Our brain pays attention to novelty. It gets kind of dull with just this mindless repetition.
So I'm thinking to myself, back to the theme of our conversation, learning to walk again and again. And uh, I wonder if it's possible to think about some of the things some of the sequences or ideas that you tried when you were in the process of relearning how to walk. And would it be possible right now to do something small for anyone who's listening to this who is curious about maybe they would like to improve or learn how to walk? For example, I know I have clients who've had many falls,
Oh,
and they walk in terror, and hold themselves in different ways, and working in standing or working with one leg or something can sometimes help these people. And I was just wondering if there were any movements that we could try now. Again, I don't mean to put you on the spot,
yeah.
but I just thought it might
I'm
be
just thinking
interesting.
of all the things what I've done. Well, one of the things that brings to mind is, you know, and you know this, being a practitioner, a lot of Feldenkrais lessons are developmentally based. So if we look
Mhm.
about the trajectory of how does a baby learn how to roll over, how does a baby learn to roll over and start to creep and then to crawl and then to bear weight, and so that's a really rich way of thinking about it. Like I'm learning to walk. Before walking, there's all these other ingredients that have to go into to be there to allow walking to emerge. So often, when I'm working with myself and I'm working with my clients, we kind of are regressing back down the developmental sequence in a way to go to the place of like, okay, what can you do fairly well? And so if we did something um, like like being on your hands and knees, if that's possible, that might be a place to start, and to start to do some basic crawling movements would
Mhm.
be really rich in relation to balance and in improving walking gait. I don't know if we probably don't have enough time to do a whole lesson.
No,
um,
no, no. I wasn't thinking of a
yeah,
whole lesson. I was just thinking
yeah,
about,
but that's what, that's um and for me, there was a time where I couldn't even do that. It's like, okay, well, I can't do that. What'd be the reverse? It would be that, well, can I sit in a way, and then going from sitting to all fours to hands and knees, and so that became a series of lessons too. So, and that continues to be rich exploration. I just got back from teaching in our Seattle training program, and we call it the Feldenkrais crawl. You know that lesson where you're crossing one knee over the other as you're
Mhm.
crawling, and it totally changes up the use of your spine and your hips. And so again, it's a novel way of crawling, but you stand up and you walk, and it's like, oh my gosh, what happened? What happened? How am I moving my pelvis like a salsa dancer right now?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know if you're familiar with that new thing called MoveNat, but
Yeah,
they do that move a lot in their trainings. And the first time I saw it, I was like, oh, I wonder if they took that from Feldenkrais. So, well, I mean, I'm sure that as people are watching the summit, they're seeing and learning about many different resources for accessing these kinds of lessons, because I think that any one of them can be helpful. What you reminded me of as you were talking, of course, was this beautiful quote that we often use of making the impossible possible, the possible easy, and the easy elegant. That instead of starting with this idea of impossible, that I start with what feels good, what is elegant for me right now, what is easy for me right now, and then build on that instead of trying to get up and walk, which a lot of times when people are trying to relearn how to walk after falling, the most dangerous place for them to be is to be vertical.
right, right. You're right. Absolutely. So I say start with what's easy, and with a sense of fluidity or flow. If you can find elegance in any movement, that that feeling sense, that felt sense, will transfer to your other activities. It's not just state dependent on what you're doing, and you can start to practice that. It's like, how can I go from sitting to standing and create that sense of ease and elegance? And work with yourself there, not just skipping over to the end. It's like, oh yeah, I just need to take my 10,000 steps, and any way I do it. I just don't feel that that's so useful, because you end up practicing maybe patterns or ways of doing it that are not your most effective, I think.
Right. And I just want to hark back to something which I think could be important and useful for anyone who's watching this. And that was the idea that you brought when you said you were working with a Feldenkrais trainer who used vibration. So, when people think vibration, a lot of times they think about tuning forks or they think about sound. Can you talk a little bit about how we use vibration in Feldenkrais?
Yeah, it's something that it's more like, if it's a hands-on. Well, we actually do it in some lessons too. It's more like you think of oscillation. So you can do it in awareness to movement lessons by creating these oscillatory movements, usually learning to move your center, you move your dantian, your pelvis, and the deep muscles of your core in this quicker oscillating movement. And then we have different techniques in functional integration where you're kind of doing more of a it's a compression, push and release, push pull, but again at a little bit lighter, higher intensity that creates a rocking or oscillatory movement like that. That is, it turns out to be really, really important biologically, right? It's just like when we're healthy, every time we walk, we're giving our brain, our nervous system, these little oscillations, these little vibratory movements. But if we shot you up into space and you were an astronaut and you lived on the space station for 3 months, you wouldn't have that input. And it turns out it's not so good for our physiology. So in a way, it's like really restorative, right? It's really part of the setting the basic motor template again to feel that, and to feel that in our bones, right? So our bones are there to transmit force. And so you can find, we have ways of bringing these micro forces through the skeleton that wake stuff up. I mean, it's fascinating.
So I could do that right here, right? Just kind
Yeah.
of bouncing up
Yeah.
and down and feeling it in my
Or you
sacrum.
or you could lay on the ground and put your feet against a wall,
Right.
right? And use
Right.
the pushing of the wall and create. I mean, there's a whole series of different lesson schemes that you can do.
I think we forget that our bones conduct
Yeah.
vibration, right? Our bones.
Yeah. Or we don't know, right? When you take it for granted until we lose it, right?
Right. Until exactly.
Yeah.
Well, Dwight, you mentioned at the very beginning that you had a quote that you wanted to share that was relevant to what you had gone through. Maybe this is a good time for you to talk about it a little bit. Give us the quote to
Hopefully
ponder upon.
let me see if I have the quote here. Here we go. I do. I did think I had a little bit. This is by Viktor Frankl, and he was a psychiatrist and very philosopher. So I tend to go to find my own personal philosophy in the events that happened in my life. So this made sense at the time when I was asked for a quote about, kind of what the whole topic of this might be. He says, "In the depths of winter, I finally learned that within me there lay an invincible summer. This is the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances." I think he was a Holocaust survivor also.
He was, and that was
Yeah.
that was a quote from his experience. People asked him how he managed to maintain his sanity.
Yeah, exactly. And Billy, I've been on, I say, the idea of going down the rabbit hole, I've been on that edge of like, it's that choice, and I can do something to intervene, or or not. And so I've chosen this path at the moment, and it seems to be helping. So I'm going that way.
Well, it reminds me of the quote from supposedly attributed to the Buddha, right? That pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional.
Yeah, I think I saw that on a bumper sticker.
That's where I get all my really good information.
It said Buddha, so it must be correct if the bumper sticker.
Well, do you have any final things that you would like to share with our audience before we sign off? Any words of wisdom or hope for those who are trying to recover from different challenging situations?
Yeah, I just hope, just from maybe somebody listening, that they have some hope that maybe something we've said can inspire somebody to seek out to do something for themselves, because there's always something. And I tell this with my clients. There's always improvement, and don't listen to when somebody tells you, "Oh, well, you're not going to improve." I mean, that's like, it's so terrible when that happens, and it's not true. It's just not true. There's always way that you can improve, and I feel free to be a resource if somebody wants to contact me. They may, and love to communicate more and help people out.
That's great, Dwight. Thank you so much. I really appreciate everything that you've said. And if people do want to get in touch with Dwight, you can find all the information about him and his profile on the Feldenkrais Summit website. Thanks again. It was wonderful talking
Okay.
to you.
Thanks, Lee. Great talking to you. Thanks. All right.